In 1950, something disappeared from American seed catalogs. Not one plant, dozens. Perennials that fed families for decades, removed quietly, without explanation. Plants that required one planting and returned every year were replaced by annuals that died after a single harvest. Most people never noticed, because most people had already forgotten what their grandparents knew. There's a survival rule embedded so deeply in modern thinking that it feels like nature itself. Food comes from planting. Planting happens every season. Every season requires new seed. But that's not a law of biology. That's a business model. And it only works if you never ask a simple question. What if you didn't have to replant? What if the most resilient food system wasn't the one you restart every spring, but the one that never stops? What if you could plant something once, walk away for 20 years, and it would still be feeding your children? That knowledge existed. It fed people through famines, wars, and collapse. And then it was erased. Not because it failed, because it worked too well. Stay with me. What you're about to hear could change how you see survival. When supply chains break, annual crops become a ticking clock. You plant in spring. You harvest in fall. You store what you can. Then winter comes. And if the stores run out before the next harvest, you face a gap nothing can fill. That gap has killed more people than bullets. During the siege of Leningrad, people who stored grain survived weeks. People who planted victory gardens survived months. But the families who had perennial food sources, fruit trees, berry bushes, root vegetables that returned every year, survived winters. Storage ends, regeneration doesn't. Most survival advice today is built around the same assumption. Accumulate more cans, more buckets, more freeze-dried meals. But accumulation has a ceiling. You run out of space, you run out of money, you run out of time. And when systems fail for longer than your supplies last, you're not prepared. You're just delayed. Perennial crops don't have that problem. They don't require new seed every year. They don't require perfect conditions. They don't require you to guess how long the crisis will last. They simply keep producing. One planting, decades of food. And the people who understood this didn't call it gardening. They called it survival infrastructure. But somewhere between industrial agriculture and suburban lawns, that knowledge was buried. Not lost, buried. Before seed catalogs, before garden centers, before you could order food with a phone, people planted systems. Not crops, systems. In Appalachia, families planted ramps, wild onions that returned every spring for generations. One patch, planted by a great-grandfather, fed great-grandchildren. No replanting, no reseeding, no starting over. In the Mediterranean, fig trees planted by Romans still produce fruit 2,000 years later. One tree, planted once, fed families through empires, plagues, and wars. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous communities cultivated camas lilies, bulbs that multiplied underground and returned every year without human intervention. A single planting created a food source that lasted lifetimes. These weren't experiments. They weren't hobbies. They were the foundation of survival. Perennial food systems required one decision: what to plant and where, and then they took care of themselves. You didn't manage them. You harvested them. In Central America, chaya, a perennial leafy green, was planted once and harvested for 20 years. Higher in protein than spinach, more calcium than milk, drought resistant. One plant could feed a family. In West Africa, moringa trees grew without irrigation, fertilizer, or care. Leaves, pods, seeds, roots, all edible. One tree, decades of nutrition. In the Andes, indigenous farmers cultivated oca, mashua, and uluco, tubers that returned every season without replanting. While European colonizers brought wheat and potatoes that required constant labor, these crops simply existed. You planted them once, they fed you forever. And they didn't just feed people during abundance, they kept them alive during collapse. So why don't you know about them? German forces occupy Greece, Allied blockades cut off supply routes, famine spreads across the islands. In the villages that relied on annual wheat crops, people starved. The grain ran out. The next planting season was months away. There was no resupply. But in villages with perennial systems, fig trees, grapevines, olive groves, wild artichokes, families survived. Not comfortably. But they survived. Because the food didn't stop. The trees kept fruiting. The vines kept producing. The artichokes kept returning. One planting, decades earlier, created a buffer that annual crops could never provide. 1990s. Cuba. The Soviet Union collapses. Food imports drop by 80%. Fertilizer, fuel, and machinery disappear overnight. Annual crops, wheat, corn, rice, require industrial inputs that no longer exist. Yields collapse, rationing begins. But the families who had planted perennial systems, plantains, cassava, pigeon peas, moringa, kept eating. Not abundance, but calories, renewable calories. One planting years earlier became the difference between hunger and survival. Horn of Africa. Drought. Annual crops fail across Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia. Grain stores empty. International aid struggles to reach remote communities. But in villages where moringa trees had been planted generations earlier, families stripped the leaves, ground the seeds, and ate the roots. One tree per household. Planted once. Still feeding people 30 years later. This isn't folklore. This is recorded survival. Perennial crops don't care if supply chains collapse. They don't care if you run out of money. They don't care if the next planting season never comes. They just keep growing. And the people who planted them didn't do it for sustainability. They did it because it worked. Perennial crops have a problem. They can't be sold every year. You plant asparagus once and it produces for 20 years. You plant a fruit tree once and it feeds your family for decades. You plant rhubarb once and your grandchildren harvest it. That's excellent for survival. But it's terrible for business. Annual crops require new seed every season, new fertilizer, new pesticides, new equipment. Every year the farmer buys, every year the company sells. Perennials break that cycle, and anything that breaks the cycle gets quietly removed. In the early 1900s, seed catalogs were full of perennials. By the 1950s, most had disappeared. Not because they stopped working, because the tech worked too well. A customer who plants once and harvests for 20 years isn't a customer. They're independent, and independence is bad for profit. Hybrid seeds replaced heirlooms, annuals replaced perennials, patents replaced preservation, and the logic was simple. If you can't sell it every year, stop offering it. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was economics. And it worked. Most people today have never heard of sea kale, skirret, or Good King Henry, perennial vegetables that fed Europe for centuries. They've never tasted ostrich fern, groundnut, or ramps. They don't know that asparagus, artichokes, and rhubarb are perennials because grocery stores sell them like annuals. The knowledge wasn't banned, it was simply made irrelevant. Until it wasn't. Modern research is finally catching up to what subsistence farmers always understood. Perennial crops require less water, less fertilizer, and less labor than annuals. Their root systems, some reaching 15 feet deep, access nutrients and moisture that shallow annual crops never touch. They prevent soil erosion. They sequester carbon. They create habitat. But most importantly, they produce food without replanting. A study from the Land Institute compared perennial wheat to annual wheat. The perennial variety required 50% less water, zero replanting, minimal fertilizer, and it produced for over a decade from one planting. Another study on perennial rice in China showed comparable yields to annual rice, without the fuel, labor, or seed costs. One planting, multiple harvests, years of production. Nutritionally, many perennials outperform their annual counterparts. Chia has more protein than spinach. Moringa has more iron than beef. Perennial kale survives winters that kill annual crops. But the real advantage isn't nutrition, it's resilience. Annual crops are fragile. They depend on perfect timing. One late frost, one dry month, one pest outbreak, and the entire harvest fails. Perennials adapt. Their deep roots survive drought. Their established biomass recovers from damage. They don't gamble on a single season. They spread risk across years. And in survival, risk management is everything. Biology always knew this. Science is just now writing it down. The systems we depend on are becoming less reliable. Supply chains stretch longer, fuel costs rise, fertilizer becomes scarce, water tables drop. Annual agriculture, the system that feeds most of the world, of course, requires stability. And stability is ending. Climate instability doesn't favor crops that depend on perfect timing. Energy decline doesn't favor food systems that require diesel, chemicals, and constant labor. Economic fragility doesn't favor families who must buy new seed every year. The future belongs to what endures without input. Perennial food systems are not a romantic return to the past. They are a functional adaptation to an unstable future. And the knowledge required to build them still exists. Not in universities, not in corporations. In the quiet memory of people who never forgot. The families still planting asparagus they'll harvest in 20 years. The communities still tending fruit trees their grandparents planted. The gardeners still cultivating rhubarb, lovage, and Egyptian walking onions. They're not preparing for collapse. They're already living in the system that works when everything else doesn't. And they're not waiting for permission. Survival favors what needs less and gives more. It favors what you plant once and harvest forever. It favors what doesn't require resupply, reseeding, or luck. The future doesn't belong to those with the biggest stockpiles. It belongs to those who planted systems. If remembering what was forgotten matters to you, subscribe to Roots of Survival. Every share helps keep this knowledge alive. In 1950, perennials disappeared from seed catalogs. Not because they didn't work, because they worked without needing to be sold again. And for 70 years, most people forgot they existed. But forgetting isn't final. The plants are still here. The knowledge is still here. And the people who understand that survival is built on regeneration, not storage, are still planting. One decision, decades of food. We didn't lose this knowledge. We stopped teaching it. And what stops being taught can start again.